In order to understand what happened in the Ukraine and what situation we're dealing with now, we have to understand the source of the current tension. Yanukovych was elected the president of the Ukraine by promising the Ukrainian people that he will finalize, sign, and put into action the European Treaty to integrate into the European Union, which gave him the vote of the Ukrainian people. Negotiations were held to complete the process, treaties were signed and initially signed, and were already supposed to sign at the Vilnius summit. Unexpectedly for the Ukrainian people, at least for those living in the western and central parts of the Ukraine, the Prime Minister announces that he terminates the activities aimed at integrating with the EU. This was preceded by meetings with leaders of the Ukraine and Russia. And some rumors came about, and there was an opinion that Ukraine is changing its foreign economic policy and is prone to customs union. At that point, obviously, rose a wave of protests, which in fact were justified, and the deceived people went out on the streets to demand to implement Yanukovych's pre-election promise and accomplish the signing of the EU treaty and putting it into practice. Initially, the agenda was to secure a European future for the Ukraine. Later, there were attempts to pressure by force. Students in particular were prosecuted, which led to more massive events. The number of protesters grew several times, dozens of times. Even the Sunday meetings would gather up to 500,000 people who demanded for the treaty to be signed. As a result of the Ukrainian government's inadequate response and attempts to solve the problem by force, occurred a big resistance in Kiev and central and western Ukraine. Consequently, radical nationalistic sentiments appeared. In general, existence or absence of alien ideology can nurture radical nationalist sentiments. The problem here was that what was demanded in the bottom could not be fulfilled by those at the top. And in this ideological vacuum, radical nationalists came about with their agenda, which gave them a large army of like-minded people in the Ukraine. So they owned the situation and started to dictate the policies in Maidan. Later, when the issue was supposed to be solved and the process that lasted 2-3 months had to end somehow, the Ukrainian government decided to close the issue by appealing to rather severe methods, as a result of which civilians were killed. Government buildings were attacked by radicals. Maidan went towards self-defense, which resulted in clashes that we know, as a result of which had more than 80 casualties. Consequently, those 3 foreign ministers came in together with the leaders of the so-called opposition. A treaty was signed to come out of the crisis, which was not undersigned by Russia, by the way. So all the parties agreed except for Russia and Maidan. Because we have to admit that Maidan was not represented by opposition. There were completely different sentiments there. They had their own vision regarding Ukraine's future. Maidan simply turned down what was agreed upon and even booed the leaders who came to Maidan and tried to justify that the treaty was the utmost that we could favor and get from the president of the Ukraine at this point. As a result, Yanukovych understood that using armed forces at that point was full of unpredictable consequences, and he simply resigned, left his residence, and fled. As a result, the situation was that the Ukraine was left without a president, without power. So a revolutionary government formed. How do you assess the Western policies throughout the whole process? At the initial stage, the West was not participating in any way in protests. It was just encouraging to stay away from using force against peace protests. When I was following the events, I didn't see any Western guidance, although proponents of conspiracy believe that this was a planned event. But to plan such a massive protest against own nation is honestly hard. At the initial stage, it had a spontaneous nature. However, later, when it became systematic, the West began to work in this direction by supporting. We saw how Catherine Ashton and U.S. Deputy Secretary of State came to Maidan and showed their support to participants at Maidan. This was already a direct support which the West was showing in this process. As a result, the authorities of the country were not allowed to appeal to radical methods and means to solve the problem. The West was the guarantor that there shouldn't happen bloodshed or any other form of violence against the protesters. Whereas we witnessed that the process transformed from peaceful state to clashes. The guilty and the instigator was the government, which tried to terminate activities at Maidan with Berkuts. They attacked the Maidan and saw what a big power they presented. They tried to clear up that area, but saw how big the resistance was. As a result, there was a counter-offensive. A simple revolution, a normal one that we witnessed many times throughout the history of mankind about people who move towards revolution. How would you comment the development in Crimea? In this case, in fact, Russia poured a cold shower on the West with an unexpected move. How will this end? To say that it was unexpected is wrong. For Russia, Crimea has a vital importance, strategic importance, defensive importance. It is obvious that the Ukraine is irrevocably changing its foreign policy. If during the Orange Revolution in 2004, brought to power still had the opportunity to return to Russian political field, which happened by the election of Yanukovych as the president, as we've seen, whereas now the victory at the expense of deaths of 80 people will not be compromised. The compromise will lead to disintegration of the Ukraine. Russia understood this very well, and as a priority, it placed the issue of guaranteeing its security, which is to secure the existence of military base located in Crimea. Why is this important for Russia? Is because if the Ukrainian government decides to apply for NATO membership by having a military base of the opposite bloc is simply impossible. In fact, the military base in Crimea is the guarantee for non-membership of the Ukraine in NATO. Consequently, they had to appeal to concrete measures. But as always, everything was done in a non-professional way. This could be done in a more intelligent way, in regard that it was claimed that the Russian-speaking population is under threat. Also, rumor had it that the Ukraine had to terminate the Kharkov Treaty, through which it was entitled to rent the base in Crimea, as well as the threat for their citizens was the fundamental base for the Russian president to come up with a proposal to use armed forces in the territory of the Ukraine. We saw that not a single threat for the Russian-speaking population or any attack or any form of problem related to the Russian-speaking population of the Ukraine, particularly in Crimea, was there. There was no threat. They were not used force against. I would say right the contrary. We've seen that in Kharkov and Donetsk, there was a revenge by the Russian speakers. And here, bringing facts was rather poor in the sense that there was no threat. Crimea is mostly populated by Russian speakers, and they were not under threat. At least in practice, there was no threat for them. Although it is still being claimed that Russia has not sent troops to the Ukraine, it's just it got the approval to do so by the Federal Council as prescribed by the Constitution. Still, we see that there are armed people without identification in Crimea with armor that closed all the inputs and outputs. If Russia denies that they are its forces, it means that they are an assault, which should be isolated. If no one takes the responsibility for those people who closed all the roads, who are armed, who do not reveal their identity and use arms, then this is an immediate threat to the people living in Crimea. Someone should be held responsible and state that it is me who's there. Aren't the Russian actions in Crimea a severe violation of the Budapest Treaty? And what possibilities does the treaty give to the parties of the treaty other than Russia? What can be applied? It is relevant that you moved on to international law. I should say that the events in the Ukraine opened a new page in international relations, international diplomacy, and the implementation of norms of international law. Namely, we see that Russia, being member of numerous UN treaties and conventions, and having signed the Quadrilateral Memorandum in 1994, with which three countries, UK, US, and Russia, guarantee the territorial integrity of the Ukraine and the integrity of borders, political self-governance, possibilities of economic development, we see that Russia unilaterally, at least, intends to violate the memorandum which it had signed. It has an intention. I can't speak about the legal terms of the violation at this point, but the fact that Crimea is being forcefully retained in the field of Russian influence, by which it guarantees the existence of its military base in Crimea and Sevastopol. The violation will not stir any legal consequences. In fact, it is just a memorandum where the parties have agreed to guarantee. This will cause the loss of Russia's international reputation as a loyal partner, because once you've agreed, you should implement. We see that at the moment Russia does not lean towards keeping the power of its own signature, whereas in general, as regards the principle of territorial integrity that is prescribed in the international law, are currently in the face of violation. Why? Because in order for one country to use force against another, the decision of the UN Security Council is required, or the use of armed forces has to be precisely proved and motivated. So far, there are precedents to that, namely, by the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a military intervention which was ultimately close to the procedures prescribed by the international law. In the case of Afghanistan, all the norms of international law were maintained. In case of Iraq, they couldn't reach the decision of the UN Security Council, while all the doubts were available that chemical weapons were being proliferated there. Moreover, the chemical weapons had been used against peaceful citizens, in particular against the Kurds in northern Iraq. At that time, large numbers of Kurds were killed. In general, the point that US is allowed while Russia is not is being largely manipulated and discussed. The problem here is not about the entities, but what causes the use of military force. Whether all the possible mechanisms and tools are used before appealing to military force, the available institutes in the international law, the procedures that international doctrine prescribes, in order not to go in a military way of solving the problem. I can say for sure that in case of Iraq, the United States have attempted to do everything in order to avoid military intervention. Because, first of all, the U.S. government is democratic, which is accountable towards its people. It takes the responsibility for every deceased citizen. And to make such a decision precise, concrete reasons were required. We've seen that they existed in reality. Of course, the chemical weapons were not found, but the success is that the authoritarian power was demolished. In this case, we didn't see procedures preceding the military use. Although it could be possible to find possibilities. It could be possible to send an observer group to Crimea. It could be possible to use the possibilities of the OSCE, the EU, the UN, why not? It could be possible to find formats of cooperation. If the point was the security of the Russians, if that was the problem, then if the point was the security of the Russians, if that was the problem, it could be solved very easily in the international format, bilaterally, trilaterally, and encourage the Ukrainian government to restore the language status as well as constrain fascist ideologies and its spread. And alongside the gained guarantees that the Russian-speaking minorities in the Ukraine will enjoy the rights prescribed by the Constitution and international laws. We have witnessed that they were not attempted nor applied. The decision to use military force was immediately made. I believe this was a quick decision to make on behalf of Russia. It was possible to solve the problem by other means and not lead to such attention. Does that mean that comparisons are irrelevant with Iraq and Afghanistan? As a final outcome, we can compare with Iraq as a final outcome. There was a final outcome. The U.S. used military intervention in Iraq without UN Security Council sanction. The same will be done by Russia, so in that regard we can compare. But what did the U.S. do before the military intervention? How many years of negotiations preceded the intervention? How many UN missions were sent over to Iraq? How many times Hussein was asked to open up the possibilities to examine and study? Once they gained a rejection by the Iraqi leader who didn't allow to enter the areas where there could be chemical weapons, as a result of which decision was made, and there was this case that chemical weapon was used in northern Iraq. So they are different in form and content. Russia's and the U.S. strategies are different. The approach is different. As a final output, there is similarity. How should the West tolerate Russia's policy of such kind? What steps do you foresee, and what steps do you consider necessary today? It is hard to say at this stage because it seems that steps are being made to encourage Russia to act within the framework of international law, which is the geopolitical and economic isolation. The upcoming G8 summit in Sochi can be considered cancelled, as well as economic sanctions, which the West will attempt to use against Russia, as well as other formats within which there will be attempts to find dialogues with Russia, and the format exists. As we speak, an extraordinary session of EU foreign ministers is underway, which was summoned by Catherine Ashton and the Ukraine. As we speak, an extraordinary session of EU foreign ministers is underway, which was summoned by Catherine Ashton around the Ukrainian problem. And I think that the EU has all the possibilities to find a solution through mediation mission of Germany or France or Franco-German alliance. And I think that the EU has all the possibilities to find a solution through mediation mission of Germany or France or Franco-German alliance. What is optimistic for me is that, as we know, yesterday the Russian President and German Chancellor have come to an agreement in their telephone conversation to send to Crimea an observation mission within the OSCE. This makes me hopeful that the West, namely the EU, will find possibilities to cooperate with Russia, which will minimize the launch of military actions and escalation of tension. At least it will be the beginning of a process which will temporarily, or forever, I hope, eliminate the use of armed forces in the Ukraine, which is, speaking otherwise, declaration of war to a state, which is when you intrude the country with arms without the country's consent. It's a war. Whereas in case of Ukraine and Russia, the war will be a disaster. All the possible means and mechanisms should be found in order not to let it happen. Neither the European Union nor the U.S. recognize Yanukovych as the president. During a recent press conference, he mentioned that he is and continues to be the legitimate president of the country. Today, does he have the right to be called a president or no? Not only did Yanukovych, but other high-ranking Russian officials have stated that Yanukovych remains to be a legitimate president. The one who stated this, the prime minister, is a lawyer by profession. There is a huge difference between the words legal and legitimate. Legitimacy is the possibility to run authority that a certain leader has, namely making decisions, implementing those decisions, and investing a resource in it. Whereas legal is prescribed by the constitutional regulations for election or impeachment processes. Now Yanukovych is not a legitimate president. Maybe Yanukovych is a legal president, because the impeachment process prescribed by the Constitution was not retained. But in fact, it's a revolution with all the obvious consequences. But speaking about Yanukovych's legitimacy is, I would consider, illiteracy. These days, both Kerry and McCain talked about Cold War, trying to persuade Russia about its unacceptability. Do you see potential today? Frankly speaking, you cannot identify the Soviet Union of the 50s with today's Russia. These are different units with economic, geopolitical, military potentials. The Soviet Union could afford the luxury of entering a Cold War with the West, namely with Europe, which was heavily deprived and damaged in post-war infrastructure. The US has undergone lesser damage because of the war. I think Russia today cannot enter a long-term Cold War with the West. Economically, politically, demographically, culturally, it doesn't have any relevant resource. In your opinion, how will current affairs relate to Russia and Russian integration projects? In post-Soviet area, economic and political processes with the Ukraine's participation and without it are different in form and content. Integration processes with the participation of the Ukraine have huge potential to restore infrastructures created at Soviet times and sum up a political resource, which is to consolidate that resource. Without its participation, it will just be a half step, a process that has no perspective. It is very well perceived by Russia. It is very well perceived by other partners that are in the customs union and other potential parties that assume to create Eurasian partnership. The process was active because Russia was sure that Ukraine would join it sometime, and everything was moving in that direction if not for Maidan. And the Ukraine would join if the Ukrainian people hadn't struggled for its freedom and its European future. But the situation today is that Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine do not even have an intention to think about participating in post-Soviet integration, while without them, it will be just another phase of satisfying the aspirations of Russian imperialism. So you don't see any perspectives? I don't. More than that, I have a feeling that both Russia and Armenia got what they wanted from the process called customs union. So what did Russia gain? What it gained is that Armenia refused its aspiration of EU integration. Armenia gained the lowest rate of its reputation ever. In fact, Russia gained a fully controlled economic and political system, while Armenia in return gained cheap gas, gained its migrants the possibility to live and work freely in Russia. The parties did not expect more, in my view. Since customs union without a common customs border, when the free movement of goods, services, capital, and human resources wouldn't be guaranteed, because there was a country which was in a different economic system and a different bloc, which would naturally create technical and content obstacles for the transfer of goods, I think additional obstacles would be created for Armenia. Likewise for Russia. We add also the unsettled confrontation in Nagorno-Karabakh, the special attitude of Belarus and Kazakhstan towards Azerbaijan. Where will be the outer border of the Union? Would Turkey open the so-called foreseen outer border of the customs union with Armenia? And what would be the reason behind it, since there is no note on that by official Turkey, regardless that for about 5-6 months the membership process is underway, which means that Turkey should be speaking about not having a closed border with Russia, whereas it doesn't talk about this. Therefore, as an analyst, I can infer that the parties gained what they were expecting to gain. This is my personal opinion. I won't attempt to predict what the result will be. But the process will slow down. And we talk about Armenia's membership in the customs union. It will slow down and even be postponed. Why? Because Russia is facing more important issues to solve. And Armenia's membership is not the issue for Russia to allocate resources in this difficult situation, where we already see that Russian stock exchange is experiencing a huge decline. Deals in the stock exchange have already been cancelled. Russia may face a huge economic collapse, as well as the exchange rate of the ruble. And in this regard, to assume a new burden such as Armenia, and the latter is very weak at this point and is expecting support from Russia, and Russia is not able to support since it has more important problems to invest in. I think what the parties have acquired will be enough. It may be good because de jure and de facto we will not become the member of the customs union. Many parallels are drawn in regard that Crimea can become a precedent for the Nagorno-Karabakh. Do you see a similar scenario? I do not want to even think about it. I wouldn't even want to. I do not want to even think about it. I wouldn't even want to. I hope our government will be clever enough not to draw parallels between Crimea and Nagorno-Karabakh. These are entirely different cases, absolutely different. The people of the Nagorno-Karabakh have gained the right of self-governance and independence. Nagorno-Karabakh is independent de facto and possesses its state borders. Nagorno-Karabakh is independent de facto and possesses its state borders, while Crimea is in the process of Ukraine's territorial integrity. And separatism in the 21st century, especially in such a confrontation within the package of international law, I simply see at this point as impossible unless there is a military intervention. Even Crimea itself does not claim to withdraw from the Ukraine. Even the newly formed authorities in Crimea do not speak about withdrawing from the Ukraine. But Karabakh is an entirely autonomous state. It is not dictated anyhow by the central government of Azerbaijan. It makes decisions internally. It possesses all the required attributes of self-government, which is not there in case of Crimea. It doesn't claim to. We may be running ahead of the Crimean people and their government to become independent of the Ukraine, but they do not want to. In your view, What will be Turkey's actions? There were publications in the media that Crimea will join Turkey. I wonder how Turkey will react to this action of Russia. Turkey has stakes in Crimea. This is not something new, and Turkey has staked claims, but Turkey views Crimea as part of the Ukraine. This was said by Davutoglu on March 1st in Kiev during his meeting with the current Ukrainian Prime Minister. It was announced that Turkey defends Ukrainian territorial integrity and sees Crimea as part of the Ukraine. If there are any manifestations of separatism regarding withdrawing Crimea from the Ukraine, Turkey will not stay away from that process. A concrete process will start, and Turkey, being part of NATO, and NATO will not let Crimea separate from the Ukraine. A phase of concrete actions will start, and we shouldn't forget that Turkey is our bordering neighbor. Armenian government does not recognize the new authorities of the Ukraine. Why? And in your view, how will this later on impact the Armenian-Ukrainian relations? I wouldn't say that they do not recognize. I'd say they didn't state they recognized. That creates a different situation. At this point, it is very difficult for Armenia. Difficult in the sense that, on the one hand, we have a strategic partner. We are part of CSTO. We have Russian military base in Armenia. On the other hand, our immediate neighbor, Turkey, being counterbalance of the strategic polarity and a leading country having NATO's biggest army in their territory and in the region, to weigh and counterweigh these two forces on the border of Armenia is the number one problem for the Armenian authorities. Look, in this confrontation, in this tension, we've heard the names of various international organizations, but I didn't hear a single word about CSTO. After all, Russia is a member of CSTO. Russia is making a decision to use military force against another sovereign state. This is Russia's separate decision, which does not have anything to do with CSTO. But at least it is worth consulting with member states of CSTO and taking into account their stakes and benefits, because in case of unfavorable developments, these states are automatically involved in war. It should be considered as a scenario. Therefore, it would be desirable to stick to the partnership format environment and consult on constant basis, or summon an extraordinary session of CSTO board where Russia will share its intentions with the partners, at least to keep them ready. So there is a feeling that the CSTO member states are not immediately favoring Russia's actions in the Ukraine. This is a serious challenge, and Armenia should reconsider its guarantees of security and consider whether today's guarantor of security may become a source of threat tomorrow for Armenia. We witnessed the same CSTO policy during the war in Georgia in 2008. Georgians have highly praised Armenia's position at that time. At this point, do you consider Armenia's position as sufficient in regard to the Ukrainian developments? Armenia should abstain from any announcements, abstain from any actions at this point. If any announcements should be made, then it must be the announcement about the neutrality of Armenia regarding this issue. Because Ukraine is a brotherly country and Armenia doesn't have any issues with Ukraine. And we must be very cautious in this matter. It is desirable not to do anything. In case of doing, just announce about its neutrality. It is the only thing Armenia should do. Later, when everything ends, or in the long run, we should seriously ponder what to do next. Although the situation is not yet finished, I assume we can make preliminary assumptions about how it will influence the region and particularly Armenia. You probably wanted to ask whether there will be Maidan in Armenia or not. I assume that was your question. In the region, Georgia had its Maidan a long time ago. In case of Azerbaijan, I can't say anything because I'm not aware of current processes in Azerbaijan. As to Armenia, I can state that for Armenia, it is an extremely undesirable Maidan. The Maidan in its form and content that happened in the Ukraine, namely clashes with the police, casualties, radical sentiments, semi-fascist ideologies. We simply cannot afford that. But we also shouldn't say that Armenia should stay away from this issue because priorities in the world are changing. The world is changing. Due to the events in the Ukraine, we will live in a different reality. And we should adapt our policies to the newly emerged situation. Therefore, Armenia should find ways to diversify its economic and security policies. Find a bilateral format of cooperating with NATO as a military alliance, with the United States as a bilateral cooperation by maintaining good and positive relations with Russia. How will this happen is a very tough issue. It requires serious political and diplomatic skills for Armenia to be able to implement. But this is the number one issue for Armenia. Armenia should reconsider its foreign economic and political priorities and be able to diversify them. Will the West consider Eastern policies after those developments? We speak of the West in a collective sense, which includes both the US and the EU. We have witnessed that in case of Armenia, the US was neutral. That is, they didn't intervene or interfere in the de facto fiasco of the Eastern Partnership, the abortion of the European integration, which we no longer have. We have a partnership search. The US has silently observed the process, whereas in the Ukraine, they were not observers. They were active and direct participants. We saw the active and personal mission of the U.S. Secretary of State in the Maidan events, his bilateral and multilateral conversations with the Ukrainian oligarchs, how they were convinced to appear in the Western political field, how Rada became entirely pro-Western, how former fractions of regions became advocates of Ukrainian EU integration path. In Armenia, the U.S. did nothing. Thus, the EU, being the most developed and perfect economic structure, being the center and basis of value system, cannot yet find its geopolitical identity. And here, the US and the EU should find a cooperative and mutually beneficial format in order to succeed. The European Union will promote values and well-being, will demonstrate its inner capacity. But when it comes to physical existence and security, they all become secondary. And today, regardless how unfortunate it may sound, the EU is not capable of assuring Armenia's security. It can be done by the US. So the security which is in Armenia can change? Is there such a concern? The security guarantee may become a source of threat. It may, as a result of change of the situation. That is, Armenia's presence in CSTO can become dangerous. Despite the fact that Armenia should remain a loyal partner, should remain a predictable partner, and remain loyal to the principles it fostered, and loyal to the position within signing for association with European integration. It has to remain loyal, but it has to think of diversifying it. Will the United States give that opportunity? Yes, I think they will. We simply have to approach this issue timely and in the right way.
Պետք է ընդհանրապես ճիշտ ժամանակին եւ ճիշտ ձևով խնդրին մոտենալ։